How realistic are hallucinations? I like to tell people that to me, and probably to other people with psychosis, it's as realistic as breathing. Breathing is something that we all trust to be real despite not being able to see air or necessarily taste air or feel it come into our lungs. So to people who don't really think about it, like it doesn't seem like there's a lot of evidence there, but we all believe that that is our reality. Now, hallucinations are similar because they're technically not visible or tangible, but to the people experiencing them, we have a trust that that is our reality, just like we all trust that we breathe. So the evidence that isn't there doesn't necessarily sway at all our belief system, because to us, we are seeing things. And with tactile hallucinations, we are feeling things. And with auditory hallucinations, we are hearing things. If anything, it's more realistic than what she would necessarily experience outside of psychosis. I'm going to stick to my own personal experience, and I'm also just going to stick with auditory hallucinations because I feel that my experience with auditory hallucinations is a lot easier to explain. A lot of people think of psychosis as hearing voices in your head, and I think that's probably like the most common depiction that I come across is the whole hearing voices in your head. Now, realistically, it's not always in your head, and I've actually only ever had one instance where I had an internal hallucination of hearing something inside me. Most of my, well, pretty much all of my hallucinations are external, and I hear them all around me. I hear different kinds of voices. I hear them in different locations. I hear different volumes. I hear multiple people. I hear one person. A lot of times it's not people. Sometimes they're angry people. Sometimes it's like a dog or a doorbell or a car engine, which are some common ones that I've touched on a lot because they're more common for me. But yeah, it can be anything and everything auditory. It's not even necessarily human. Sometimes people ask questions like, do you engage with your hallucinations? Or like, can you keep yourself from talking to them? No, not for me at least, because they're real. So I wouldn't know that they're hallucinations. I know there are people who are aware when they're hallucinating, but I'm not. So yeah, I engage with them because like, I wouldn't know. I'll share with you just two very distinct hallucinations I've had that I think really paint a better picture of how realistic an auditory hallucination can be, because there are like different variables to them that pretty much determine why they felt so real. The first is just hearing multiple people around me who aren't directly talking to me, because most of the time I'm not actually being addressed, but what's really common for me is just hearing a bunch of people around me and hearing them from different locations and being able to pinpoint, like they're in the corner of the room, they're sitting on the couch, it's that voice coming from that specific friend. I know it was Caitlin, I know it was Rob, and being able to hear their steps, like hearing the floorboards creak when they walk across them, being able to hear the change in their volume as they maybe got more excited, but not really being able to hear what they're saying because it's just sort of like, it's just chatter. And the second one is a more recent one that happened when I was incredibly stressed. So I do still sometimes hallucinate when I'm incredibly stressed. And it really frustrated me because I could hear faint music, but I couldn't make out what it was. At first, I thought it was my neighbors next door because it sounded like there was sort of a barrier between me and the music, but it wasn't the neighbors. And then it sounded like maybe I had left my headphones plugged into my phone and that I'd left my phone under the covers of my bed because I was in my bed, and it sounded as if I had turned the volume all the way up on a song and the music was coming through the speakers of my earbuds. So it sounded like that barrier, like it was being filtered through something, and it was quiet enough that I couldn't quite make out what it was, but it sounded that specific. It literally sounded like music coming through the earbuds of my phone. And what was really frustrating about that was it was really good music. Like, I loved that song, and I don't know what it was, and I don't know if anyone has similar taste in music with me. I'm sure there are people who like Franz Ferdinand and Modest Mouse, but it sounded a lot like a cross between Franz Ferdinand, and Modest Mouse. So if you can imagine that, it sounded great. And I could like kind of hear the lyrics, and I was like straining to hear what the lyrics were, but it was just a little bit too quiet, but I could tell they were singing words, and I could hear the melody and the instruments, and it was very detailed, but it was just too quiet. Does that sound realistic to you? Because to me, there's no differentiating. That's why I can't tell when I'm outside of reality, because my new reality is 100% realistic. There's just no way anyone can tell me what I'm experiencing isn't real, and that's why it's so hard to come out of hallucinations. I tend to stick with the same examples for describing hallucinations and delusions over and over and over again, because A, there are so many more than I can count. A lot of them I don't remember until they pop up years later. And also, there are just no words to describe a lot of what I experience. I still can't make sense of most of the delusions that I've had. I don't understand what I believed. It doesn't make sense to me. I don't think it ever will. So I've kind of figured out in my mind at least how to describe the structure of some of these delusions and not necessarily the content of the delusions. Wordplay is a large part of this because I kind of tend to believe that a lot of my delusions are based on things that are already going on in my head. So that would be why I have so many delusions related to my favorite movies and books. And something that I really enjoy that I already think a lot about is wordplay. And I love puns and I love rhymes, and I get a big kick out of, for instance, my handle, which is Psychotic in Seattle. And if you haven't picked up on that, it's a wordplay of Sleepless in Seattle, and my delusions kind of adopted their own nature based on my love of wordplay. So now that I've unlocked that clue to what my delusions are about, I've kind of had a few delusions fall into place that I now better understand. Here's an example for you of a delusion of mine that was warped because of wordplay. There are two factors to this delusion that are important to remember, one of which is that I was a major stoner at the time and I smoked a lot of joints. The second being that my best friend at the time has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome like me, which is a genetic disorder that causes your joints to dislocate. And the key word here is joint. Now, this friend of mine really looked out for me at the beginning of one of my episodes, and just like me, she smoked a lot of marijuana. And I was legendary for rolling the best joints of anyone around, so I would often offer her joints. We'd hang out, I'd roll her a joint, and then I'd give her one to go, and I'd always be like, hey, do you need a joint? As a delusion, this really escalated, and the phrase, do you need a joint, turned into something a bit more sinister. And I went from thinking that I was just a friend offering her a joint to me being all powerful and having the ability to control her dislocations and save her from having dislocations by rolling her a joint. And the thing about delusions, at least for me, is that they're cyclical and they tend to repeat and repeat and repeat, and the situation just keeps going in a loop and it escalates more and more. So it went from me saving her joints to me being the cause of her joints dislocating to me having the power to roll joints to dislocate anyone's joints. I stopped rolling joints. I couldn't even smoke marijuana without thinking that I was causing everyone's joints in the world to dislocate. So the wordplay of do you need a joint was blown out of control. So that might seem like a really innocent example of something absolutely innocuous that could not be harmful at all, but I guarantee you that my mind can make anything dangerous and anything scary, no matter how small and insignificant it may seem. So that is just an example of how wordplay, which is something that I really love, can escalate and spiral into a drastically dramatic delusion. Something that I do a lot when I'm psychotic is I just tend to wander. And I'll get up and leave wherever I am and just walk aimlessly for miles and hours, usually until the police pick me up. That's typically what ends the wandering. And I do it because I might be afraid of my environment and I need to leave, or I feel called to go somewhere, or I feel that I have to find something and I've got to look until I know what it is. I usually don't even know what it is. So this wanderlust, as I call it, is a strong drive to just go with a vague purpose in mind, but really no clear resolution. So I might have an end goal, but the route getting there is very complicated. On one of my little wandering bouts, my goal was to get to my mom's house. I know what my mom's house looks like in normal reality, but in that reality, I wasn't going to know what it looked like until I got there, and I was going to have to follow patterns to get there and cross the street when I saw certain objects, stuff like that. Like I had to follow certain colored cars. So instead of a straight trajectory, I would follow a red car and then another red car this way and then a red car this way. So it would take hours to get anywhere near where I thought I was supposed to be going. And by hours, I mean that I would typically walk from one day into the next because my wanderlust would generally kick in around sundown. So once the sun would start to set around like 5 or 6 p.m., I would take off and I wouldn't typically be found until the next day. So one time I got picked up around 4 a.m., another time I got picked up around 11 a.m., and this was just me straight wandering for all those hours. I walk really fast. And I know I can walk very long distances in a short amount of time. So maybe 20 miles on average I would be walking. Yeah, I know that might sound like exaggeration, but I'm a backpacker, so I'm used to walking 10, 15, 18 miles a day anyway. So it's really not that hard for me. But you know what's crazy is I was never lost, not technically. I knew where I was, but it's almost like the buildings had different meanings to me. Like the building with the wind chimes suddenly had significant meaning, even though it was just some regular apartment complex that I wouldn't notice on any other day. Colors had meaning, shapes had meaning. For some reason, I would like lose my shoes because I'd think it was like a symbolic sacrifice to leave them by water fountains. I lost a lot of shoes. And I don't think I ever did reach these destinations that I had in mind because it was almost like I was on a mission and the rules of the mission kept changing because it went from, all right, you're following this color to now you're counting numbers, and the purpose just would get lost in all of the like hunting patterns and being on some mission to find things like side quests and shit. So yeah, I never really ended up where I was going. And yeah, really the only thing that ever stopped it was getting picked up by the police. I don't know that there ever would have been a point where I would have reached my destination. I don't think that was even possible. So yeah, I know a few people have told me that they also tend to wander. Let me know if you are also a wanderer and what that's been like for you and what it takes for you to stop your wandering, because I'd really love to know. A lot of people have caught on that I am very tall. I'm 6 feet tall. I love being tall. I've always wanted to be tall, so this is kind of like a life goals achieved kind of thing for me. But the thing is, I used to think I was much, much taller. When I was psychotic, I thought I was a giantess, and I thought that I was so tall that my mind literally couldn't conceive of humans anymore. I basically believed that my mind would break if it saw things for how they really were, and my mind, to protect me, would have to translate images to me in sizes that I understood. I was so much bigger than humans that to understand the size ratio, I saw them as pine cones or spools of thread, because those were sizes in proportion to my average size that made sense. That was about the same scale. It didn't hurt that I thought I was a goddess, and I thought that all of these small objects around me were worshipers who had come to adore me. I never really realized that I was alone, and I would spend a lot of time like talking with them as if they were like actual people, just very small scale people. And I couldn't make out what they were saying to me because they were just so little. They were just such tiny little people. My mind would break if it tried to figure it out. That's why my mind translated them to me as objects, because it was too mind-blowing, the size difference between me and the actual people. This came into play with a lot of different things, and I actually got bitten by a spider in the toe because I was having a friendly little conversation with it, thinking that it was just a normal-sized human. So that's just one of those weird, wacky things that my brain did to me while I was psychotic, and I'd be interested to hear if anyone else has this same sort of delusion. of being a drastically different size and how you see the world from that size. I'd love to hear it, so please let me know. Performing daily tasks with psychosis can be 10 times harder, and even the most basic things can become very, very challenging. I struggled a lot with getting dressed because I thought that my clothes had certain coded messages to them, and that wearing certain colors would bring demons into my life, or certain symbolism like foxes, for instance. Wearing anything with foxes was bad luck. And when I say bad luck, I mean just the most awful, horrible, damning things would happen that would ruin my soul. So I struggled to pick out what to wear. Sometimes I would wear really odd combinations of clothes. I would wear all sorts of like layered necklaces and chokers, and I'd wear sunglasses everywhere because I thought that if people could see into my eyes, they would know what I was thinking. So I wore very, very eclectic stuff. I also struggled with other really, really basic things like toileting and showering because I just didn't understand the mechanics of these tools. Like, I didn't know what a toilet was sometimes. I literally didn't know. And I would go to the bathroom outside or in buckets because I just didn't know what a toilet was. And someone actually had to explain to me how to use a toilet. I didn't know how to use a shower either. I didn't know what a shower was. I don't know how to explain why I didn't know what these things were, but I lost that concept of understanding those basic mechanics. So I would bathe out of a bucket. I would go to the bathroom in buckets. I didn't know how it worked. And I also didn't know what food was, and I refused to eat because I believed that the food that was presented to me was actually human flesh or feces in disguise. And I was not going to eat that. So even things like bread, very basic things like bread, to me would be inedible. And I lost a lot of weight as a result because I was refusing most of the food that was being provided to me, and I wouldn't eat on my own. Psychosis is considered to be one of the most disabling conditions worldwide. And there is good cause for that, because when you lose the ability to have control over your thoughts or your perception of reality, it's very hard to function on a day-to-day basis and perform daily things that we take for granted. So understandably, you need a lot of help, and sometimes people are put into roles where they have to care for their loved ones. Unfortunately, not everybody has someone caring for them, and that is why psychotic people make up a large part of the homeless population. 20+% of the homeless population is people with psychosis. And that's a lot considering that people with psychosis make up 2% of the global population. It is a stark change in numbers. So keep that in mind when you are dealing with people in psychosis, that they need a lot of patience and they need a lot of help, because it's not like we necessarily can take care of ourselves. Some people can, I've been able to, but to a degree, sometimes not everyone is capable of just basic human daily things. There was something that bothered me the other day that I just can't quite get out of my head, because it's actually something that I've talked about on my TikToks before that maybe isn't expressed enough, and that is validity and being valid in your symptoms and diagnosis and illness, what have you. I don't typically like to talk about medication because a lot of people try to compare dosages and medications like it's some sort of like medication Olympics. A lot of times it's the same with diagnoses or symptoms, where there's some sort of an unspoken competition that I just didn't sign up for. So naturally, I don't really like when people drag me into their comparisons, when people try to impose that on me, because I'm not trying to compare myself to anyone. I like to think I have a lot of empathy for people who experience psychosis on any level, because I believe that on any level it can be very traumatizing, and that in itself is valid. The point I'm making is that recently someone tried to imply to me that their psychotic experience was worse or like harder than mine because they have ongoing symptomatic psychosis, whereas I am basically in remission and I only have episodes. And there is so much to that that is it's insensitive, like it's invalidating. There's a lot more to psychosis than the length of your experience. The length of your psychosis, whether it's ongoing or episodic, is not a reflection of the severity. There are people who completely lose touch with reality, whereas there are people who have an awareness of their symptoms. They know when they're hallucinating and they can function to a certain degree. Then there are people who are completely incapacitated and need a lot of care because they can't even leave the house without, getting into an unsafe situation. I have had it both ways. I've had episodes that were less severe where I was aware of my symptoms, and I've had severe enough episodes that they were disabling and I needed caretakers to look after me, and I needed a lot of help because I couldn't take care of myself. I needed help being prompted how to bathe because I didn't know how showers worked. I had to be told how to use a toilet because I didn't know what a toilet was. Like, at that level of care, it doesn't matter if it's ongoing or episodic, it is incredibly severe. So I really hate this game of I have it harder than you, mine is worse than you because of one variable in a much larger picture. There's a lot that just gets swept under the rug when you look at someone and say, oh, your episode was only a month. Try 2 years. No, that's bullshit. That's like absolute bullshit. So I will say it again. Your psychosis is valid regardless of whether it's a disorder or drug-induced or postpartum, regardless of if it's episodic or ongoing, regardless of the severity. Your psychosis is valid.